The wind that morning carried the smell of coming snow and wood smoke, the kind of cold that worked its way under your coat and settled into your bones whether you wanted it there or not. Gideon Mercer sat hunched on his horse at the edge of Black Hollow, studying the town like a man approaching something that might bite. He'd been riding for 3 days straight from his homestead in the high country, and every muscle in his back screamed about it. The horse, a bay mare with a white blaze and a temperament meaner than most people, shifted beneath him, equally unimpressed with their destination. Black Hollow wasn't much to look at. Maybe 30 buildings if you counted generously, half of them leaning like drunks against the wind. The main street was rutted mud frozen into waves, and the few people moving through it looked about as welcoming as the weather. Gideon touched his heels to the mare's sides and rode in anyway. He needed supplies. Salt, flour, ammunition if they had any worth buying, maybe some coffee if the prices weren't robbery. His homestead was stocked well enough for winter, but spring was still months away, and a man living alone in the mountains learned not to gamble on having enough of anything. The general store squatted near the center of town, its windows gray with dust. Gideon tied the mare to the rail outside and went in, the bell above the door clanging harsh in the quiet. The man behind the counter looked up with the expression of someone interrupted from more important business, which in this case appeared to be reading a yellowed newspaper. He was thin, sharp-faced, with the kind of mustache men grew when they wanted to look more significant than they were. "Help you?" "Need supplies," Gideon said. "Got a list." He pulled the folded paper from his coat pocket, smoothed it on the counter. The shopkeeper picked it up, squinted at Gideon's handwriting like it personally offended him, then moved off between the shelves without another word. Gideon turned to study the store while he waited. Sparse stock, prices marked too high on what was there. A barrel of apples near the door had more bruises than fruit. This was the kind of place that knew it was the only option for 50 miles and priced accordingly. The door opened behind him, bringing another gust of cold and 2 women in heavy shawls. They stopped talking the instant they saw him, which he'd learned to expect. Strangers drew attention in small towns, especially ones who looked like they'd been living rough. "Morning," he said, touching the brim of his hat. They nodded, uncertain, and moved toward the dry goods. Their voices dropped to whispers immediately, not quite quiet enough. "That church business."
"Shame, really. But what did she expect? No family, no prospects. Samuel Granger's cousin, he was supposed to..." Gideon tuned it out. Small-town gossip ran like water, constant and pointless. He'd grown up in places like this, knew how they worked. Everyone knowing everyone else's business, using that knowledge like currency or weapons depending on the day.
The shopkeeper returned with his arms full, dumping items on the counter with less care than Gideon would have liked for things he was about to pay for. $42, the man said. "List says 38. Prices went up." "When?" "Last week." Gideon looked at him for a long moment, then pulled coins from his pocket and counted them out slowly. The shopkeeper swept them into his cash box with visible satisfaction. "Need help loading that?" "I'll manage." Gideon gathered what he could carry in one load, heading for the door. He'd have to make 2 trips, maybe 3, but that beat paying some kid to help and probably break half of it in the process. Outside, the wind had picked up. He loaded the supplies into his saddlebags, working methodically, when he heard the church bell start to ring. Not the regular pattern for a service. This was erratic, urgent, the kind of ringing that meant something had gone wrong. People emerged from buildings up and down the street, moving toward the sound. Gideon ignored them, focusing on securing his supplies, but the current of bodies grew stronger, pulling more of the town in that direction. Then he heard the shouting. "She's got no right. Someone get her out of there. Somebody find the preacher. This is disgraceful." Curiosity got the better of him. Gideon left the rest of his supplies and followed the crowd toward a small church at the end of the street. It was white once, probably, though weather and time had stripped that claim to bare wood in places. A group had gathered on the steps, maybe 20 people, all focused on the door. No one seemed willing to actually go inside, which told Gideon whatever was happening in there carried some kind of social weight that made people cautious. "What's going on?" he asked the nearest person, an older man in a coat held together mostly by stubbornness. "Woman's barricaded herself inside," the man said, not looking away from the door. "Won't come out." What'd she do? Exists mostly. The old man spat into the dirt. Though she's making a scene about it now. Before Gideon could ask what that meant, a younger man pushed forward through the crowd. Well-dressed by Black Hollow standards, coat that looked new, boots with actual shine on them. He carried himself like someone used to being listened to. "Alara!" he shouted at the church door. "This is ridiculous. Come out and stop embarrassing yourself." No answer from inside. "You can't stay in there forever. The preacher wants his church back." Still nothing. The well-dressed man turned to the crowd with visible frustration. "Someone needs to go in and drag her out. This has gone on long enough." "You do it, Thomas," someone called. "She's your problem." "She was never my problem," Thomas shot back. "My cousin backed out of the arrangement weeks ago. What she does now isn't my concern." "Still your family name attached to it." "Was attached. Past tense." Thomas straightened his coat with exaggerated dignity. "Samuel made his choice. Smart one, if you ask me. That woman's been nothing but trouble since she arrived." Gideon listened to this exchange with growing distaste. He didn't know the specifics, but he recognized the tone. This was how small towns worked when they decided someone didn't belong. They circled like wolves, made a show of it, enjoyed the spectacle. "What exactly did she do?" Gideon asked, loud enough to cut through the murmuring. The crowd turned to look at him as one, only now noticing the stranger in their midst. Thomas sized him up with obvious skepticism. "This is town business, friend. Nothing that concerns you." "I'm standing here listening to grown adults berate a woman through a church door. Makes it my business if I'm watching it." "She's in there because she refuses to accept reality," Thomas said coldly. "My cousin was supposed to marry her 3 weeks ago. He changed his mind. It happens. Most people move on. She decided to make it everyone's problem instead." "Changed his mind or was told to change it?" the old man beside Gideon muttered. Thomas shot him a look that could have stripped paint. "Careful, Ed. Just saying what everyone's thinking." Ed shrugged. "Your Uncle Silas didn't want his nephew marrying a woman with no land and no family. Whole town knows it. Boy gets cold feet right before the wedding, and Silas just happens to offer him a job managing the North Range the same week. Convenient timing. That's speculation and slander. That's how things work around here, and you know it." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Whatever the truth was, Gideon could tell they all had opinions about it, but no one wanted to state them too clearly with Thomas standing right there. "Point is," Thomas said, raising his voice, "the wedding didn't happen. She needs to accept that and leave town. Instead, she's been haunting the church for days like some kind of ghost, making everyone uncomfortable." "Haunting it how?" Gideon asked. "Sitting in there. Just sitting. Won't work. Won't talk to anyone. Just sits in the front pew like she's waiting for something that's never coming." Thomas gestured at the door with visible irritation. "It's pathetic." "So leave her alone. It's a church. People need to use it." "Seems to me if your faith is that fragile, the problem isn't her." That got some surprised looks and a few poorly suppressed laughs from the crowd. Thomas's face darkened. "You don't know anything about this situation, stranger." "Know enough? No, I wouldn't want to be in a town that treats women this way." Gideon turned and started walking toward the church steps. "Where do you think you're going?" "To talk to her." "She won't listen. We've all tried." "Maybe she's tired of listening to people who don't mean her well." Gideon climbed the steps, his boots loud on the old wood. Behind him, the crowd's murmuring grew louder, speculation and shock mixing together. He reached the door and knocked, firm but not aggressive. "Ma'am, name's Gideon Mercer. Like to talk to you if you're willing." Silence from inside. He waited, giving her time. The wind pushed at his back, and he could feel the crowd's attention like weight against his shoulders. "I'm not from this town," he continued. "Don't know you. Don't know them. Just passing through for supplies. But I heard how they're talking about you out here, and I figure you deserve better than that." More silence, then faint from inside. "Go away." "Can't do that just yet." "Why not? Everyone else wants me gone. You should too." Her voice was rough, like she'd been crying recently but was working hard not to let it show now. Gideon recognized that sound. He'd heard it in his own voice before, years ago. "Because I think you're sitting in there trying to figure out what comes next," he said to the door. "And I think these people want to make that decision for you. Seems to me you should get to choose for yourself." A long pause, then,
There's nothing to choose, no money, no family, no prospects. They're right about that much. That true? Would I be in here if it wasn't? Plenty of reasons to hide in churches, not all of them about being broke. I'm not hiding. Sure sounds like hiding from where I'm standing. Another pause, longer this time. Gideon waited. Behind him, someone in the crowd said something he didn't catch, followed by nervous laughter. "What do you want?" she asked finally.
Talk to you face to face instead of through a door.
Why?
Because I'm trying to be polite. Nobody in this town has been polite to me in 3 weeks. Why would you be different? Maybe I'm better at it. He paused. Or maybe I just don't like crowds deciding things for people who should get to decide for themselves. He heard movement inside, footsteps on the church floor. The door opened a crack, and a woman's face appeared in the gap. Pale skin, dark hair pulled back but coming loose, eyes red from crying but sharp with something harder underneath. She looked like she'd been beautiful once, and might be again if the world stopped crushing her for a while. "You really just passing through?" she asked. "That was the plan." "Then pass through. This isn't your fight." "Didn't say it was a fight. It will be if you keep talking to me. This town's made up its mind about who I am." She started to close the door. "Save yourself the trouble." "Wait." Gideon put his hand on the door, gentle but firm. "What's your name?" She hesitated. "Ilara. Ilara Voss." "Nice to meet you, Ilara. Now, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer." "What? You want to stay in this town?" I can't." She stopped, frustrated. "There's nowhere else to go." "That's not what I asked." Ilara looked at him properly then, searching his face for whatever trap might be waiting there. Gideon kept his expression neutral, letting her look. "No," she said finally, quiet. "I don't want to stay here." "Good, then don't." "It's not that simple." "Could be." He paused, aware that what he was about to say would sound insane. "I've got a homestead 3 days north of here. High country, isolated, hard living, but it's mine, paid for, no debts. Winter's coming, and I could use help getting through it." Her eyes widened. "You're offering me work?" "Something like that." "You don't know me. Don't know you're not a hard worker either." "This is..." She shook her head. "This is crazy. You could be anyone. Could say the same about you." Gideon shrugged. "But here we are. You're trying to figure out what comes next, and I'm offering you something other than this town's mercy, which doesn't seem worth much." "Why would you do this?" He considered the question. Honest answer was, he didn't entirely know. Something about seeing her cornered by people who should have been better than they were. Something about recognizing the look in her eyes, the exhausted endurance of someone who'd survived worse than this, but didn't know how much more they had left in them. "Because I remember what it's like when everyone decides you're not worth their time," he said. "And I remember wishing someone had offered me a way out when I needed one." Ilara stared at him for a long moment. Behind Gideon, the crowd had grown quieter, straining to hear what was being said. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked carefully. And Gideon, who'd ridden into town planning to buy supplies and ride out the same day, who'd spent the last 5 years building a life specifically designed to avoid complications, who knew he was about to make a decision that would change everything, said, "Marriage." The word hung in the cold air between them. "You're insane," Ilara said. "Maybe. You don't even know me." "Already established that." "This is... People don't just..." She stopped, breathing hard. "Why?" "Because you need a way out of this town, and I need..." He trailed off, surprising himself by not having a ready answer. "I need to stop being alone out there, I suppose. Gets harder every year." "You want a wife. I want help. Company. Someone to talk to besides my horse, whose terrible conversation." He met her eyes steadily. "I'm not offering romance, Ilara. I'm offering partnership. You work, I work, we survive winter. Come spring, you decide if you want to stay or if I help you get somewhere else. Your choice. Either way." That's not how marriage works. That's how this one would work. Behind him, someone in the crowd had clearly heard enough of the conversation to figure out what was happening, because suddenly the murmuring exploded into shocked exclamations. "He's proposing? To her? Is he drunk? Someone stop this. Thomas pushed forward. This is insane. You can't be serious. Gideon didn't turn around. Private conversation, Thomas. I know everyone in this territory. I've never heard of you. For all we know, you're a criminal. For all you know, I'm a decent man making an honest offer. To marry a woman you met 30 seconds ago. Longer than that, actually. Been talking at least 5 minutes. Some of the crowd laughed at that, which made Thomas's face go red. Elara, he said, trying a different approach. Be reasonable. You don't know this man. He could be dangerous. Could say the same about staying here, she replied, still looking at Gideon. We take care of you. Like you've been taking care of me? Her voice went sharp. Standing outside the church demanding someone drag me out? That's your version of care? We were trying to help you move forward. You were trying to make me leave so you didn't have to feel guilty anymore. Thomas opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Samuel made his choice. I'm sorry it hurt you, but making rash decisions out of spite won't. This isn't spite, Elara interrupted. She pulled the door open wider, stepping into full view. She was thin, wearing a dress that had been nice once but showed hard use now. This is survival. You all made it very clear I have no future here. Now someone's offering me a different option, and I'm taking it. You can't possibly. Watch me. She looked back at Gideon, and he saw something shift in her expression. A decision being made in real time. Maybe not the smart one, maybe not the safe one, but hers. You meant what you said? She asked. About me choosing? Come spring, I could leave? Have my word on it. Your word worth anything? More than most things. She studied him for another moment, then stepped fully out of the church, pulling the door closed behind her with finality. Then yes, she said clearly, loud enough for the whole crowd to hear. I'll marry you. The town erupted, people talking over each other, shock and outrage mixing together into noise. Thomas looked like he'd been slapped. Someone called for the preacher. Someone else laughed, high and a little hysterical. The old man, Ed, just shook his head with something that might have been approval. Well then, Gideon said, feeling the weight of what they'd just agreed to settle over him like snow. Guess we need to find someone who can make this legal. Preacher's probably in his house, Elara said. Behind the church. You sure about this? Are you? Asked you first. No, she said honestly. I'm not sure, but I'm more sure about this than staying here another day. Good enough. They walked together through the crowd, which parted reluctantly. People stared like they were witnessing something scandalous and couldn't look away. Whispers followed them, sharp with judgment and fascination. The preacher's house was small, neat, with smoke coming from the chimney. Gideon knocked, and after a moment a man in his 60s opened the door. He had kind eyes and the patient expression of someone who'd heard every variety of human foolishness and stopped being surprised by any of it. Can I help you? Need you to perform a marriage, Gideon said. Today, if possible. The preacher blinked. Today? Rather not wait. I see. He looked past them at the crowd that had followed. This about what I think it's about? Probably. The preacher sighed, but he was already reaching for his coat. Come inside, both of you. Let's talk about what you're doing before you do something you can't undo. They followed him into the small house. It smelled like coffee and old books. The preacher gestured them toward a table, poured them each a cup without asking, then sat down heavily. I'm Reverend Michaels, he said. Been running that church for 20 years, seen a lot of marriages start. Seen more than a few end badly. He looked at Gideon. You're not from here. No, sir. Got a homestead 3 days north. And you, Miss Voss, you understand what you're agreeing to? Marriage is sacred. It's not something to enter lightly out of desperation. Desperation's all I have left, Elara said quietly. Might as well use it. That's not a good reason to marry. What would be? Love? Romance? She laughed, bitter. I was promised that 3 weeks ago. Look where it got me. Reverend Michaels turned to Gideon. And you, son? Why are you doing this? Gideon took a long breath. Because I watched that crowd out there treat her like something broken they wanted to throw away. And I figure anyone who can stand in a church alone while a whole town tries to force them out has more spine than most. That's worth something. Worth marriage? Worth taking a chance on. The Reverend studied them both for a long time, his coffee going cold in his hands. Outside, they could hear the crowds murmuring, waiting to see what would happen. "I'll do it," he said finally. "But I want you both to understand something first. Whatever arrangement you think you're making, whatever practical reasons you have, marriage has a way of becoming more complicated than plans. You go into this thinking it's just survival, just convenience, and you might be right. Or you might find yourself in something deeper than you expected. Either way, you'll be bound to each other legally and in the eyes of this community. That's not something to dismiss." "We understand," Gideon said. "Do you?" The Reverend looked at Alara. "Do you truly?" She met his gaze without flinching. "I understand that staying here will destroy what's left of me. And I understand that whatever risk I'm taking with him," she nodded at Gideon, "can't be worse than the certainty of staying." "All right then," Reverend Michaels stood. "Let's make this official before I change my mind about the wisdom of it." They followed him back to the church. The crowd had grown, word spreading that something unprecedented was happening. Gideon spotted the shopkeeper from earlier, the two women in shawls, Thomas still looking furious, Ed wearing an expression of grim satisfaction. Inside the church, it was cold and dim. Light came through simple windows, catching dust in the air. The space smelled like old wood and candle wax. Alara walked up the aisle without hesitation, and Gideon followed, very aware that this was probably the strangest thing he'd ever done. Reverend Michaels positioned them in front of the altar, opened his Bible to a marked page. "Any witnesses?" he called. Ed shuffled forward, nodding. "I'll stand for them."
"You don't even know them, Ed," someone protested. "Know enough. Know they're choosing each other instead of letting this town choose for them. That's worth witnessing."
The Reverend began the ceremony, his voice steady and practiced. Gideon listened to the familiar words, love, honor, cherish, knowing they meant something different in this context than they were supposed to. This wasn't a love match. This was two people making a deal to survive, using marriage as the framework because it was the one society would accept. When it came time for vows, they repeated the words mechanically. Gideon's voice stayed level. Alara's wavered once, but held. "Do you have a ring?" the Reverend asked. Gideon hadn't thought of that. He reached into his pocket, found a piece of leather cord he used for repairs, tied it clumsily around Alara's finger. It looked ridiculous, but she didn't laugh, just stared at it like it meant something. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Michaels said, "I pronounce you husband and wife." No one clapped. The silence in the church felt heavy, judgmental. Gideon turned to Alara, saw her looking back at him with something between relief and terror. "Guess we're married," he said quietly. "Guess so. Want to get out of this town?" "More than anything." They walked back down the aisle together. At the door, Thomas stepped into their path. "This is a mistake," he said. "Both of you will regret this." "Maybe," Gideon replied, "but it'll be our mistake to make." They pushed past him, out into the cold afternoon. The crowd parted again, silent now, watching them with the fascinated horror people reserved for disasters they couldn't prevent. Gideon led Alara to where his horse was tied outside the general store. His supplies were still there, untouched, small miracle in a town this interested in other people's business. "You have anything to bring?" he asked. "Just this." She gestured at herself, the dress, nothing else. "We'll get you supplies on the way. Can you ride?" "I can learn." He finished loading his saddlebags, then mounted and pulled her up behind him. She settled awkwardly, clearly not used to horses, but gripped his coat without complaint. "Ready?" he asked. "No, but let's go anyway." Gideon touched his heels to the mare's sides, and they moved forward. The town watched them leave, silent and strange. At the edge of Black Hollow, Gideon glanced back once and saw them all still standing there, frozen like they couldn't quite believe what they'd witnessed. Then he turned forward and rode, Alara's arms tight around his waist, toward the mountains and whatever uncertain future they'd just agreed to build together. The ride took 3 days, and they were hard ones. They stopped only when the mare couldn't go further without rest, and even then, Gideon pushed harder than he should have. He wanted distance between them and Black Hollow, wanted miles and mountains and enough empty space that the town's judgment couldn't follow. Alara didn't complain. She held on to him through the long hours, her grip loosening only when exhaustion forced it, then tightening again when the horse stumbled or the trail turned rough. She asked for nothing, said nothing, just endured. The first night they made camp in a shallow canyon that blocked the worst of the wind. Gideon built a fire from deadwood while Alara stood awkwardly nearby, clearly wanting to help but not knowing how. "You know how to cook?" he asked, unpacking supplies. "Some basic things." "Good enough." He handed her a small pot and a bag of dried beans. "Water's in the canteen. Get those started while I see to the horse." She took the pot like it might explode, but she moved toward the fire and got to work. By the time Gideon finished brushing down the mare and checking her hooves, Alara had the beans heating over the flames, steam rising into the cold air. They ate in silence, the food bland but warm. Gideon watched her from the corner of his eye, this woman he'd married on impulse and now had to figure out what to do with. She ate slowly, mechanically, like someone who'd learned not to expect much from meals. "You'll sleep by the fire," he said when they'd finished. "I'll take first watch." "Watch for what?" "Animals, people, whatever decides to take an interest in us." She looked around at the darkness beyond the firelight, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. "Does that happen often?" "Often enough to be careful about it." "Have you been attacked before?" "Couple times. Wolves mostly. One drunk miner who thought I had gold I didn't have." Gideon poured himself more coffee from the pot. "Mountains are safer than people think, but they're not safe." Alara pulled her coat tighter. "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "Any of it. Live out here. Survive. I grew up in a city, worked in shops and houses. I don't know anything about homesteading or mountains or—" She gestured helplessly at the vast darkness around them. "This. You'll learn." "What if I can't?" "Then you'll learn that too." She stared at him, frustrated. "You're not very reassuring." "Not trying to be. I'm trying to be honest." He set down his cup. "You want me to tell you it'll be easy? It won't. You want me to promise you'll like it? You probably won't, at least not at first. But you asked me earlier if my word was worth anything, and I told you it was. So here's my word now. I'll teach you what you need to know. You put in the work, you'll manage. And if I don't put in the work, then we'll both have a miserable winter and regret this come spring." Alara looked at the fire, her face hard to read in the flickering light. "Why did you really do it?" she asked quietly. "Don't tell me it was just about needing help. You could have hired someone, could have found a woman who actually knew how to survive out here." Gideon considered lying, then decided against it. "I watched my brother die 5 years ago. Mining accident. Tunnel collapsed. I could hear him calling for help, but I was too far away, and by the time I got there—" He stopped, surprised at how much it still hurt to say out loud. "Point is, I spent a long time after that telling myself it was better not to care about anyone. Safer that way. But standing in that town, watching them circle you like you were something they could just throw away, I remembered what it felt like to be helpless, and I didn't want to watch it happen to someone else without doing something about it." "That's why you married me? Because you felt sorry for me?" "Pity's got nothing to do with it. I married you because you looked like you'd been beaten down but hadn't quit yet. That's worth something." He met her eyes across the fire. "And maybe because I was tired of being alone and too stubborn to admit it until I saw someone else drowning in the same thing." She didn't respond immediately. The fire crackled between them, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called out, lonely and sharp. "I was going to leave anyway," she said finally. "Even if you hadn't shown up. I had maybe enough money for a stage ticket to Denver, no plan beyond that. Would have ended up working in a saloon, or worse, probably. But I couldn't stay in that town another day." She pulled her knees up to her chest. "So I guess we both made desperate choices." "Seems that way. Do you regret it yet? Ask me again in 3 months." She almost smiled at that, just a flicker before it disappeared. "Fair enough." Gideon stood, checked the perimeter of their camp. Everything looked clear. No signs of trouble beyond the normal sounds of wilderness at night. When he came back to the fire, Alara had already wrapped herself in the blanket he'd given her, lying close to the warmth with her back to the flames. "Get some sleep," he told her. "We've got another long day tomorrow." "Gideon?" "Yeah?" "Thank you. I know this is strange and probably stupid, but thank you." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and settled in to watch the darkness, his rifle across his knees while his new wife slept fitfully behind him. The second day was colder and rougher than the first. The trail climbed steadily into the mountains. the air thinning until every breath felt sharp in the lungs. Alara grew quiet, her arms around his waist trembling from cold and exhaustion, but she never asked to stop. They passed a burned-out cabin around midday, just charred timbers and a collapsed roof. Gideon didn't slow down, but Alara turned her head to stare at the ruins as they rode past. "What happened there?" she asked. "Fire, probably. Could have been an accident, could have been deliberate. Hard to say." "Did people die?" "Don't know. Happened before I moved up here." "Does that frighten you? Being so isolated that if something goes wrong, no one would know? Better than being somewhere people know your business but don't care about it." She didn't argue with that. By the third afternoon, they reached the high valley where Gideon's homestead sat. The mountains rose around it like walls, snow-capped and indifferent. A stream ran through the eastern edge, frozen now but reliable in warmer months. The cabin itself was small and rough, built from logs Gideon had cut and hauled himself. Smoke rose from the chimney. He'd left a slow fire burning when he left, banking it carefully to last. A small barn stood nearby, and beyond that a chicken coop and a fenced area for livestock. 2 cows watched them approach with bovine disinterest. Everything looked exactly as he'd left it, untouched and waiting. Gideon dismounted and helped Alara down. She stood unsteadily, looking around at her new home with an expression he couldn't quite read. "This is it," he said. "It's very remote." "That's the idea." "The nearest town?" "Black Hollow's the closest, and you saw how far that was. There's a settlement called Timber Ridge about 2 days northwest, but I only go there once, maybe twice a year." Alara turned slowly, taking in the vast emptiness around them. No other cabins visible. No roads beyond the rough trail they'd followed. Just mountains and trees and silence. "We're completely alone up here," she said. "Yes." "What if something happens? What if one of us gets hurt or sick or then we deal with it ourselves?" Gideon started unloading supplies from the horse. "I've got medical supplies, some knowledge of doctoring. Learned what I needed to survive out here. You'll learn it too." She looked like she wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Instead, she followed him toward the cabin, her steps uncertain on the frozen ground. Inside, the cabin was simple but solid. One main room with a fireplace, a rough kitchen area, a table and 2 chairs. A bed in the corner, neatly made. Shelves held supplies, food, tools, books, everything organized with the precision of someone who lived alone and knew where things needed to be. "It's smaller than I thought," Alara said quietly. "It's what I could build on my own." Gideon added wood to the fire, coaxing it back to full strength. "Bedroom's that area there, you'll take it? I'll sleep out here." "We're married." "I know what we are. Doesn't change the arrangement." She stood in the middle of the room, still wearing her coat, looking lost. "I don't know what to do." "Right now, nothing. You're exhausted. Rest. Tomorrow we'll start figuring out how this works." "I should help with something." "You should sit down before you fall down." Alara finally moved to one of the chairs, sinking into it with visible relief. Gideon made coffee, stronger than the trail version, and handed her a cup. She wrapped both hands around it like it was precious. "It's quiet," she said after a while. "Gets quieter." "That doesn't bother you?" "I prefer it. I'm used to noise. Cities, people, always something happening." She stared into her cup. "This is going to take getting used to." "Most things do." They sat in silence while the fire grew warmer and the cabin slowly came back to life around them. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, turning the sky orange and purple. Beautiful and cold and utterly indifferent to the 2 people trying to figure out how to live together in its shadow. That night, Alara disappeared into the small bedroom area without saying goodnight. Gideon heard her moving around in there for a while, then silence. He lay down on the floor near the fire with a blanket, his usual sleeping spot when weather drove him inside, and stared at the ceiling beams he'd cut and placed himself 3 years ago. He'd built this place to be alone in, built it specifically to avoid complications, connections, the pain that came from caring about things you could lose. And now he'd brought someone into it, someone who would need things from him he wasn't sure he could provide. The smart thing would have been to leave her in Black Hollow, let her find her own way, make her own choices. But watching that crowd close in around her, seeing the trapped look in her eyes, he couldn't do it. Couldn't walk away from someone drowning when he had the means to pull them out, even if it meant drowning himself in the process. The next morning brought the reality of their situation into sharp focus. Gideon woke early, built up the fire, and started making breakfast. Alara emerged from the bedroom looking hollow-eyed, her hair tangled, still wearing the same dress she'd been married in. "You need other clothes," Gideon said by way of greeting. "Can't work in that." "I don't have other clothes. I've got spare shirts, pants that'll be too big but better than what you're wearing. We'll make it work until we can get you proper things." He pulled items from his chest, handed them over. Alara took them without comment and went back into the bedroom to change. When she returned, she looked ridiculous. His shirt hanging off her shoulders, pants rolled up at the ankles, the whole outfit drowning her small frame. "It'll do," Gideon said. "I look absurd." "You look ready to work." They ate quickly. Porridge with dried berries, more coffee. Then Gideon started showing her around. First the barn, where they kept grain and hay and tools. Then the chicken coop, where 6 hens regarded Alara with suspicion. "They need feeding every morning," Gideon explained. "Grain's in that barrel. Not too much, or they get lazy about foraging." "They forage in winter?" "They try. Mostly they'll stay near the coop, but they're smarter than they look." He showed her how to collect eggs, how to check for signs of illness or injury. The chickens tolerated her presence, but didn't warm to her the way they ignored Gideon's movements with familiarity. Next came the cows. 2 of them, both milk cows that needed daily attention. "I don't know how to milk a cow," Alara said flatly. "You're about to learn." It took longer than Gideon expected. Alara's hands were soft, unused to this kind of work, and the cows sensed her nervousness. The first one kicked over the bucket twice before Alara finally managed to get a rhythm going. By the time they finished, she was frustrated and close to tears. "This is impossible," she said. "It's not. You're just new at it." "How long did it take you to learn?" "About the same, maybe longer." He picked up the bucket of milk. "Nobody's born knowing this stuff, Alara. You learn by doing it badly until you figure out how to do it right." That's not very encouraging. It's honest. They worked through the morning, Gideon showing her the daily routines that kept the homestead functioning. How to check the livestock for problems, how to split wood properly without injuring herself, how to read the weather by watching the sky and the animals, how to store food so it lasted through winter, how to manage the fire so it gave heat without eating through their wood supply too fast. Alara tried. She struggled and made mistakes and grew visibly more frustrated with each failure, but she kept trying. That counted for something. By midday, they were both exhausted. Gideon made a simple lunch, bread and cheese, dried meat, and they sat at the table eating in silence. "I'm terrible at this," Alara said finally. "You've been here one day." "I'm going to be terrible at this for a long time." "Probably." She looked up sharply. "You could lie." "Could. Won't." "Why not?" "Because you'll figure out the truth anyway, and then you won't trust anything else I tell you." He took another bite of bread. "This life is hard. Lying about that doesn't make it easier, just makes you unprepared when things go wrong." Alara set down her food, staring at her hands. They were already red and raw from the morning's work. "I don't know if I can do this." "You can." "You don't know that. You survived a whole town turning against you. Survived being abandoned at your own wedding. Survived 3 days on horseback with no preparation. You've got more in you than you think. Or I'm just too stubborn to know when to quit." "That works too." She almost smiled again, that same flicker he'd seen by the fire. "You're strange, you know that?" "Been told?" They finished eating, then Gideon sent her to rest while he handled the afternoon work himself. He needed to check the trap lines, see what they'd caught during his absence, and that was work better done alone until she knew the territory. When he returned a few hours later with 3 rabbits, he found Alara in the kitchen area, attempting to organize supplies. She'd pulled everything off the shelves and was trying to make sense of his system, which even Gideon admitted was more practical than logical. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Trying to help. I'm useless with the animals and the wood and everything else, but I can organize things. I used to work in a shop. I know how to keep inventory." "I had a system. You had chaos." She held up 2 identical jars. "Why do you have flour in 6 different containers?" "Buy it when I can. Store it where there's room." "That's not a system. That's an accident waiting to happen." She set the jars down firmly. "I need to be useful, Gideon. If I can't do the outdoor work yet, at least let me fix this."
He considered arguing, then decided it wasn't worth it. Fine, but don't throw anything away without asking. I won't.
He left her to it and started preparing the rabbits for cooking. By the time he'd finished cleaning and gutting them, Alara had transformed the kitchen area into something almost organized. Similar items grouped together, everything labeled with scraps of paper and charcoal. It looked better than anything he'd managed in 3 years of trying. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. "I told you. I worked in shops, had to keep track of stock, know what needed ordering, what was selling. Same principles apply to a kitchen." Suppose they would. They cooked the rabbit together that evening. Alara didn't know much about preparing game, but she followed Gideon's instructions and managed not to ruin it. The meal came out better than most of his solo efforts. The meat actually seasoned with herbs she'd found in his supplies. "This is good," he said, surprised. "I can cook when I have ingredients to work with. Most of what I've lived on the past few months has been charity scraps. Not much you can do with that." They ate slowly, the cabin warm from the fire and the cooking. Outside, night had fallen completely, the darkness absolute in these mountains. No light pollution, no sounds beyond wind and the occasional animal call. "It really is quiet," Alara said, echoing her comment from the night before. "You'll get used to it." "Will I? Or you'll go mad?" "One of the two." She looked at him sharply, but he was almost smiling, and she realized he was joking, sort of. "You have a terrible sense of humor," she said. "Been told that too." Days turned into a week. Alara slowly adapted to the routines, growing slightly less terrible at the daily tasks. The cows still didn't like her, but they tolerated her enough to get milked without too much protest. The chickens remained skeptical but accepted her as the person who brought food. She learned which would split easily and which fought back, which tools to use for what purposes, how to read Gideon's mood by whether he spoke in full sentences or grunts. She also learned that living with him was strange in ways she hadn't anticipated. He was quiet, but not cold. Worked constantly, but never seemed to expect her to match his pace. Gave her space, but appeared whenever she was struggling with something too heavy or complicated. He kept his promises about the bedroom, sleeping by the fire every night without complaint. And he never, not once, made her feel like a burden or a mistake. That might have been the strangest part of all. 2 weeks in, a storm hit the valley. Not the first snow of the season, but the first serious one, the kind that announced winter was done being polite and intended to remind everyone who was actually in charge. Gideon spent the day before the storm securing everything, reinforcing fences, bringing extra wood close to the cabin, checking that the barn was properly sealed. Alara helped where she could, holding things while he hammered, carrying lighter loads, trying to anticipate what he needed before he asked for it. "How bad will it be?" she asked as they worked. "Bad enough. Could last 3 days, maybe 4. And we'll be stuck inside the whole time? Unless you want to freeze to death, yes." The storm arrived that night with a violence that made Alara understand why Gideon had prepared so carefully. Wind screamed around the cabin, rattling the shutters, finding every gap in the walls. Snow came down so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet. The temperature dropped until even standing near the fire felt barely warm enough. Gideon kept the fire fed constantly, burning through wood faster than normal, but knowing they couldn't afford to let it die down. Alara helped, learning the rhythm of when to add logs, how to arrange them for maximum heat. On the second day, they heard something against the barn. Heavy thuds, regular and wrong. "What is that?" Alara asked. Gideon was already pulling on his coat. "Barn door came loose. Need to fix it before the animals freeze." "You can't go out in this." "Can't not go out either." He tied a rope around his waist, secured it to a beam in the cabin. "Safety line," he explained, so he could find his way back if visibility got worse. Then he disappeared into the white chaos outside. Alara stood by the door, holding the rope, feeling it tug and pull as Gideon moved through the storm. Minutes stretched impossibly long. She imagined him lost, frozen, buried in snow where she'd never find him. Then the rope tugged 3 times, their signal, and she helped pull him back toward the cabin. He stumbled inside, covered in snow, his face red from cold, but he was grinning. "Got it secured," he said through chattering teeth. "You're insane." "Barn doors don't fix themselves." She helped him out of his frozen clothes, hung them to dry, wrapped him in blankets by the fire. He was shaking hard, his fingers numb, but he'd saved the animals, and that seemed to matter more to him than the risk. You could have died, Alara said quietly. Could have, didn't. That's not the point. What is the point? She didn't have a good answer for that, just a growing knot of fear in her chest that she didn't want to examine too closely. The storm finally broke on the fourth day, leaving the valley buried under 3 feet of new snow. Everything looked different, transformed and clean and dangerously beautiful. Gideon started digging them out immediately. Paths to the barn, the chicken coop, the woodpile. Alara worked beside him, her muscles screaming but her determination holding. They worked until dark, then collapsed inside the cabin, too tired to do more than eat cold leftovers before sleeping. That night, Alara lay in the bedroom and finally admitted to herself what she'd been avoiding since that first day. This place terrified her, the isolation, the constant work, the knowledge that mistakes could be deadly. But more than that, she was starting to need it. Need the routines, the purpose, the feeling of building something instead of watching everything fall apart. And she was starting to need him. Not in the way she'd needed Samuel, that desperate hope that someone would save her from herself. But something steadier. The knowledge that if she failed at something, Gideon would help her figure it out rather than mock her for it. That he'd disappear into a blizzard to save animals rather than let them suffer. That he'd married her not because he wanted something from her, but because walking away felt wrong. She didn't know what to do with that feeling. Didn't know if it was real or just gratitude dressed up as something more complicated. But it was there. Growing stronger every day, she spent learning to survive in this impossible place beside this impossible man. In the main room, Gideon lay by the fire, staring at shadows on the ceiling and wondering what he'd gotten himself into. The work was actually easier with 2 people. He'd admit that much. And the cabin felt less empty with someone else moving through it, talking occasionally, existing in the space he'd built for solitude. But it also felt more dangerous, because now when he went out into the cold, he found himself thinking about whether he'd make it back. Now when he heard wolves at night, he worried about whether she'd know what to do if they attacked while he was away. Now when he looked at their dwindling supplies, he wasn't just calculating for himself, but for someone who depended on him not to make mistakes. He'd spent 5 years building a life where he didn't have to care about anyone. And in one impulsive decision in a forgotten town, he'd destroyed all of that. The question was whether that destruction would kill them both or make them stronger than either could be alone. Outside, the wind picked up again. Not storm level, but enough to remind them that winter was far from over. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the cabin's walls, something howled, long and lonely and hungry. The howling came closer over the next 3 nights, and Gideon started sleeping with his rifle loaded beside him. Alara noticed but didn't ask about it until the 4th morning, when they found tracks in the snow near the chicken coop. Large, distinctive paw prints that circled the building like something had been testing for weaknesses. Wolves? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Pack of them, looks like. 4. Maybe 5. Gideon crouched beside the tracks, studying them with the careful attention he gave to everything that might pose a threat. They're hungry. Game's scarce this time of year, and our livestock probably smells real appealing right about now. What do we do? Keep watch. Reinforce the coop and the barn. Make sure they know we're not easy prey. He stood, brushing snow from his knees. And hope they find something else to eat before they decide we're worth the fight. They spent that day making the homestead as secure as possible. Gideon hammered extra boards across the lower sections of the coop, while Alara held them steady, her hands freezing despite the gloves he'd found for her. They checked every fence post, every gate latch, every possible entry point a determined predator might exploit. Have you dealt with wolves before? Alara asked as they worked. Twice. Lost a cow the first time before I figured out how serious they were. Second time I managed to scare them off by firing shots in the air, making enough noise they decided to look elsewhere. He tested a fence post, found it solid. But that was summer, when food was easier to find. Winter makes them desperate, and desperate wolves are a different problem. That night, the howling started again just after midnight. Closer than before, close enough that Alara could hear individual voices in the chorus. She lay in the bedroom, staring at the ceiling, listening to Gideon move around in the main room, checking the door, feeding the fire, loading his rifle. She got up, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and joined him by the fire. Can't sleep? He asked without looking at her. Not with that sound. She sat in the chair nearest the warmth. Are they going to attack? Don't know.
They're testing us, trying to figure out if we're weak enough to be worth the risk. Are we? No. He said it with absolute certainty. But they don't know that yet. They sat together in the firelight, listening to the wolves sing their hunger to the frozen stars. After a while, Gideon handed her a small pistol from his supplies. You know how to use this.
I've never touched a gun in my life. Time to learn then. He showed her how to hold it, how to aim, how to pull the trigger without flinching. His hands were patient, adjusting her grip, explaining the mechanics until she understood the basic principle, even if the execution still felt foreign and dangerous. I don't want to shoot anything, she said quietly. Neither do I, but wanting and needing are different things. He set the pistol on the table between them. You're alone here sometimes when I'm checking trap lines or hunting. You need to be able to protect yourself if something goes wrong. I thought you said this place was safer than people think. I said the mountains are safer than people think. Didn't say they were safe. He met her eyes across the firelight. Everything up here wants to survive, same as us. Sometimes that means we come into conflict. I'd rather you be prepared for that than caught off guard. The wolves didn't attack that night, but their presence hung over the homestead like a threat written in snow and sound. Gideon started keeping the animals penned closer to the cabin, sacrificing their foraging freedom for security. He set up torches around the perimeter that could be lit quickly if needed, and he taught Alara to recognize the difference between normal night sounds and the ones that meant danger was circling closer. 2 weeks later, spring started making its first tentative appearances. The snow began to melt in patches where sun hit strongest. The stream broke free from ice in places, rushing loud and urgent. The air lost some of its knife-edge cold, though morning still froze hard enough to crack stone. And the wolves moved on, following game herds or giving up on the homestead as too much trouble. Their tracks disappeared from the snow, and the nights grew quiet again. Alara felt the tension leave her shoulders for the first time in weeks. She was carrying water from the stream one morning when she heard Gideon shout her name from near the barn, his voice sharp with urgency. She dropped the buckets and ran, her heart hammering, imagining wolves returned or some new disaster. Instead, she found him kneeling in the dirt near the barn's back corner, not facing danger but staring at something small and still. "What is it?" she asked, breathless. "Look," he pointed. 2 children huddled against the barn wall, pressed together for warmth. A boy, maybe 10 years old, and a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5. Both were filthy, their clothes torn and inadequate for the weather. The boy held the girl protectively, his eyes wild with fear and exhaustion. They looked like they'd been running for days. "Please," the boy said, his voice cracking. "Please don't send us away." Ilara's breath caught in her chest. She looked at Gideon, saw him processing the same question she was. Where did they come from? How did they get here? What happened to them? "Easy," Gideon said gently, staying crouched to seem less threatening. "Nobody's sending anyone anywhere. You're hurt?" The boy shook his head, but the girl whimpered, and Alara saw her left foot was wrapped in bloody cloth, the binding crude and recent. "What happened to her foot?" Alara asked, moving slowly closer. "Cut it on something when we were running. I tried to stop the bleeding, but I don't know how to fix it properly." The boy's voice broke completely. "Please, we don't have anywhere else to go." Gideon stood carefully, held out his hand. "Come inside. Let's get you both warm and fed. Then we'll figure out the rest." The boy hesitated, clearly expecting a trap, but the girl was shivering so hard her teeth chattered audibly. Survival won out over suspicion. He took Gideon's hand and let himself be pulled to his feet, then lifted his sister with the careful strength of someone who'd been carrying her for a long time. Inside the cabin, Alara immediately started heating water while Gideon settled the children near the fire. The girl, Maisie, the boy said her name was, clung to her brother and wouldn't let go. The boy introduced himself as Caleb, and his words came out in exhausted fragments. "There was a fire. Our cabin. Ma and Pa they couldn't." He stopped, unable to finish. "When did this happen?" Gideon asked quietly. "Week ago, maybe more. Lost track of days." "You've been traveling alone all that time?" Caleb nodded. "Walked mostly at night, hid during the day. Didn't know where we were going, just knew we had to get away from there. Saw your smoke yesterday morning, watched the cabin for a while to make sure it was safe." "You've been hiding near here for a day?" "Had to be careful.
Some people, he stopped again, protective instinct warring with the need to trust someone. Some people don't want extra mouths to feed, especially kids with no family left. Alara brought over warm broth, and both children grabbed for it desperately. She had to stop them from drinking too fast, knowing their stomachs would rebel after days of near starvation. "Slow down," she said gently. "It'll make you sick if you gulp it." Maisie looked up at her with huge eyes. "Are you the mama here?" The question hit Alara like a physical blow. She glanced at Gideon, saw him watching her, waiting to see how she'd answer. "I'm Alara," she said carefully. "This is Gideon. This is our home." "Do you have babies?" "No, sweetheart. Just us." "Oh." Maisie looked disappointed, but turned her attention back to the broth, drinking more carefully now. Gideon examined Maisie's foot while she ate. The cut was deep but clean, already starting to heal around the edges. He cleaned it properly, applied salve from his medical supplies, and rewrapped it with fresh cloth. The girl cried through the process, but held still, trusting him in a way that made Alara's chest ache. "You did good taking care of her," Gideon told Caleb. "Kept the wound clean, kept her moving. That took real skill." Caleb straightened slightly at the praise, some of the fear leaving his face. "Pa taught me. Said you never know when you'll need to tend injuries in the wilderness." "Your pa was right." Gideon finished securing the bandage. "This'll heal fine if we keep it clean and dry." "So we can stay?" Caleb asked, trying to sound casual but failing completely. Gideon looked at Alara. She saw the question in his eyes, the same one she was asking herself. They were barely managing 2 people in this cabin. Adding 2 more, especially children who'd need care and teaching and resources they didn't have excess of. It was foolish, impractical, dangerous even. But Alara thought about standing outside that church in Black Hollow, waiting for someone to offer her a way out. She thought about Gideon riding into her life and choosing to help when he had every reason to keep riding. And she thought about these 2 children, orphaned and terrified, who'd somehow made it through a week of wilderness alone because they were too stubborn or too scared to give up. "They can stay," she said. Gideon nodded slowly, accepting her decision. "For now. Through winter, at least. Come spring, we'll figure out what comes next." Caleb's shoulders sagged with relief so powerful it looked painful. Maisie started crying, not from fear anymore, but from the release of tension she'd been holding since the fire. Alara pulled the girl into her lap, holding her while she sobbed, and felt something shift inside her chest, some locked door opening onto a room she'd forgotten existed. The first week with the children was chaos. Maisie wouldn't sleep unless Caleb was within arm's reach, which meant they both ended up in the main room near the fire instead of using the bedroom. She had nightmares every night, waking screaming about smoke and heat and things Alara didn't want to imagine. Caleb pretended to be tougher than he was, taking on tasks too heavy for him and refusing to admit when he struggled. Gideon handled it with the same steady patience he applied to everything else. He gave Caleb real work, feeding animals, splitting kindling, checking trap lines, and treated him like a partner rather than a burden. He carved small wooden figures for Maisie and left them where she'd find them, never making a show of the gifts. And he gave both children space to grieve without forcing them to talk about things they weren't ready to discuss. Alara found herself falling into a role she'd never expected to occupy. She became the one who braided Maisie's tangled hair, who washed their clothes and mended their tears, who woke when nightmares struck and held them until the fear passed. She taught Maisie letters using charcoal and scraps of wood, watched the girl's face light up when she recognized her own name spelled out. It was exhausting. It was overwhelming. It was the first time in her life Alara felt truly necessary. One morning, 3 weeks after the children arrived, Alara woke to find Maisie had crawled into bed beside her sometime during the night. The girl was still asleep, one small hand tangled in Alara's shirt like an anchor. Outside, she could hear Gideon and Caleb talking quietly as they tended to the animals, their voices mixing with morning bird calls and the sound of melting snow. This was her life now, not the one she'd imagined back in Black Hollow, waiting for a man who decided she wasn't worth choosing. Not the desperate escape plan she'd constructed in that church, but something stranger and harder and more real than any future she'd pictured for herself. She was a mother. Not officially, not legally, but in every way that mattered when a 5-year-old girl called her mama and meant it. The realization terrified her more than the wolves ever had. Spring came slowly,
revealing the valley in stages. First, the stream fully opened, running high with snow melt. Then patches of brown earth appeared where snow had been. Then green things started pushing through, grass, early flowers, the first signs that the world hadn't frozen permanently after all. With spring came other changes. The supplies Gideon had stocked were running low faster than expected with 4 mouths instead of 2. They'd need to make a trip to town soon, either Black Hollow or the more distant Timber Ridge, to restock essentials and trade furs Gideon had been collecting through winter. "I'll go to Timber Ridge," Gideon announced one morning at breakfast. 3 days there, 3 back, maybe a day in town. Week total. "I could go with you," Caleb offered immediately. "Need you here. Alara can't manage everything alone, especially with Maisie's foot still healing." "It's healed fine," Maisie protested. "I can walk good now." "Good, not well," Alara corrected automatically, then caught herself. When had she started sounding like a school teacher? "Someone should go with you," Alara said to Gideon. "What if something happens on the trail? I've made the trip alone a dozen times. Before you had people waiting for you to come back." He looked at her, something shifting in his expression. "I'll be careful. That's not the same as safe. Nothing about this life is safe, Alara. You know that by now." She did know it, but knowing didn't make it easier to watch him pack supplies for a week-long journey, checking his rifle, counting ammunition, preparing to disappear into the wilderness alone. Caleb helped him load the horse, asking questions about navigation and trading and what to do if you encountered dangerous people. Gideon answered everything with patience, treating the boy's curiosity seriously. "You're in charge while I'm gone," Gideon told him. "That means keeping the livestock fed, helping Alara with heavy work, and making sure Maisie doesn't wander off into trouble." "I won't wander," Maisie said indignantly. "Sure you won't." Gideon crouched to her level. "But if you do, Caleb's responsible for finding you, so maybe save him the trouble." She giggled and threw her arms around his neck. Gideon looked startled but returned the hug, awkward but genuine. Then he stood and faced Alara. They'd never discussed physical affection, never established what was appropriate between them. Their marriage was still the practical arrangement they'd made in Black Hollow, at least officially. But standing there with him about to leave, Alara felt the distance between them like something physical. "Be careful," she said again, inadequate but all she could manage. "Always am." He hesitated, then reached out and squeezed her shoulder briefly. "Keep them safe." "I will." He mounted the horse and rode out without looking back. Alara watched until he disappeared into the tree line, then stood watching the empty trail for several minutes more before Maisie tugged at her skirt. "Mama, what are we having for lunch?" "Mama." The word still caught her off guard every time. "Let's go see what we can find," she said, taking the girl's hand. The first 2 days without Gideon were fine. They managed the daily routines, Caleb taking on extra responsibilities with visible pride. Alara taught both children more letters, basic arithmetic, things they'd need if they were going to survive in this world. Maisie picked up reading faster than Caleb, which frustrated him until Alara pointed out he was much better at practical skills that required strength and coordination. The third day, one of the cows got sick. Alara noticed it during morning milking. The animal's breathing was labored, her movements sluggish. She'd watched Gideon tend sick livestock before, seen him check for fever and signs of specific illnesses, but her knowledge was superficial at best. "Caleb," she called, "something's wrong with Bessie." He came running, examined the cow with the serious expression he wore when trying to seem older than he was. "She's hot, real hot, and look at her eyes. See how they're watering? What does that mean?" "Don't know. Pa would have known, but—" He stopped, the grief still fresh enough to silence him mid-sentence. Alara made decisions based on instinct and half-remembered advice from Gideon. They moved the sick cow away from the healthy one to prevent contagion. She mixed herbs she'd seen Gideon use for fevers into the animal's water. They kept checking on her through the day, watching anxiously for signs of improvement. By evening, the cow was worse. Her breathing came in gasps, and she'd stopped eating entirely. "We should try to cool her down," Caleb suggested. "Pa used to do that when animals got too hot." They carried water from the stream, cold enough to sting their hands, and poured it over the cow's head and neck. The animal seemed grateful at first, but the relief didn't last. As darkness fell, her condition deteriorated further. Maisie sat on the fence, watching with wide eyes. Is she going to die? No, Alara said, with more confidence than she felt. We're going to help her. But privately, she was terrified. If the cow died, that was half their dairy supply gone. They needed milk to survive, needed it to trade, needed it for the basic functions of the homestead. And beyond the practical concerns, the failure felt personal. Gideon had trusted her to manage things while he was gone, and she was failing at the first real challenge. They stayed with the cow through the night, taking turns sleeping while the other watched. Alara had just dozed off near dawn when Caleb shook her awake. She's breathing different. Better, I think. He was right. The cow's respirations had eased, becoming deeper and more regular. Her eyes looked clear, and she accepted water when Caleb offered it. Whatever fever had gripped her seemed to have broken. Relief hit Alara so hard she had to sit down. Caleb crouched beside her, and she saw the same exhaustion and relief in his young face. We did it, he said quietly. You did it. That cooling idea probably saved her. Pa's idea, really. I just remembered it. Your pa taught you well. They sat together while morning broke over the valley. Two people who'd both lost their previous lives trying to build something new from the wreckage. After a while, Maisie emerged from the cabin, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Is Bessie okay? She's going to be fine, Alara said. Good. Maisie climbed into Alara's lap, warm and solid. I was worried. I know, sweetheart. Me too. Gideon returned on the 7th day, later than expected, which had Alara pacing the cabin and Caleb watching the trail with increasing anxiety. When he finally appeared, leading a heavily loaded horse, Alara's relief was so powerful it made her dizzy. You're late, she said, trying to sound angry instead of terrified. Trail was muddy from snowmelt, slowed us down. He started unloading supplies, flour, salt, coffee, fabric, ammunition, things they'd been running low on for weeks. Everything all right here? Bessie got sick. He stopped, turned to look at her. How sick? Fever, trouble breathing. We cooled her down, gave her herbs. She recovered. Show me. They went to check the cow together. Gideon examined her thoroughly, asking questions about symptoms and treatment. When he finished, he straightened and looked at Alara with something she'd never seen in his face before. Actual surprise. You did good. Better than good. Most people would have lost her with that kind of fever. Caleb remembered the cooling treatment from his father, still had to have the presence of mind to try it. He nodded at Caleb, who'd followed them to the barn. You've got real skill, boy. Your pa would be proud. Caleb's face flushed with pleasure. Thank you, sir. That night, after the children were asleep, Gideon and Alara sat by the fire going through the supplies he'd brought back. He'd gotten good prices for the furs, managed to trade for extra fabric that Alara could use to make proper clothes for the children. Heard something in Timber Ridge, he said quietly. Probably nothing, but figured you should know. What? Man was asking about a homestead in this area. Specifically asked about whether anyone knew of a couple living alone up here, woman from Black Hollow, got married suddenly this winter. Alara's stomach dropped. What kind of man? Well-dressed, too well-dressed for Timber Ridge, had the look of money and the attitude that comes with it. Gideon poked at the fire. Bartender told him there were dozens of homesteads in these mountains. No way to know which one he was asking about. Man seemed frustrated by that, pushed harder, but nobody would help him. Mountain folk don't take kindly to outsiders asking questions about their neighbors. It could be Samuel's family or Thomas. Could be. Could also be nothing, just someone looking for different people entirely. He looked at her directly. But I wanted you to know in case it becomes something. What would we do if they found us? Depends on what they want. If they're just looking to make sure you're all right, that's one thing. If they're trying to cause problems, he stopped, jaw tightening. Then we deal with that when it happens. Alara pulled her knees to her chest, suddenly cold despite the fire's warmth. She'd been so focused on surviving winter, on learning to live in this place, on caring for the children, that she'd almost forgotten about the world beyond the valley. But that world hadn't forgotten about her. I don't want to go back there, she said quietly. You won't. Whatever happens, you're not going back unless you choose to. You can't promise that. I can promise I won't let anyone force you into something you don't want. That good enough? She looked at him across the fire. This man who'd offered her an escape when she had nothing, who'd kept every promise he'd made, who'd turned their practical arrangement into something that felt dangerously close to family. "Yes," she said. "That's good enough." But lying in bed that night, listening to Maisie's steady breathing beside her and Caleb's soft snoring from his bedroll in the main room, Alara couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something they weren't prepared for, despite all their survival skills and careful planning. She'd spent months learning to survive the wilderness, the isolation, the brutal honesty of a life where mistakes meant death. But she'd never learned how to fight against people who had power and money and the law on their side. And she had a terrible feeling she was about to get that education whether she wanted it or not. 2 weeks later, a rider appeared on the trail leading to their homestead. Gideon spotted him first, from his position checking the northern fence line. He came back quickly, his face set in hard lines. "Someone's coming. Alone, on horseback, moving like he knows where he's going." "Who?" "Too far to tell. But he's headed straight for us, which means this isn't a chance encounter." They gathered the children into the cabin. Gideon loaded his rifle and positioned himself near the door where he could watch the trail. Alara stood behind him, the pistol he'd taught her to use heavy in her hands. The rider came into clear view 10 minutes later. Well-dressed, like Gideon had described from Timber Ridge, on a horse too fine for wilderness travel. He rode with the confidence of someone who expected to be welcomed, or at least didn't fear being turned away. As he drew closer, Alara's breath caught in her throat. She knew that face, had seen it at too many uncomfortable dinners in Black Hollow while Samuel's family evaluated whether she was good enough for their precious son. "That's Silas Granger," she said quietly, "Samuel's uncle." "The one who convinced him to break off the engagement?" "The same." Gideon's expression went flat and dangerous. "Stay inside with the children. Don't come out unless I call for you." "Gideon, please." She nodded and stepped back, positioning herself where she could see through the window but wouldn't be immediately visible. Caleb moved beside her, his face tight with worry. Maisie clutched her homemade doll, sensing the tension even if she didn't understand its source. Gideon stepped outside, rifle held casually but ready. Silas Granger reined in his horse 20 feet from the cabin, looking around at the homestead with visible assessment and not quite hidden disdain. "Can I help you?" Gideon asked, his voice carrying through the thin cabin walls. "Looking for someone," Silas said. His voice was smooth, educated, used to being obeyed. "Woman named Alara Voss. Heard she might be in this area." "Might be a lot of people in this area, big territory." "Don't play games with me, son. I know she's here. Married some homesteader in a hurry this winter, ran off before anyone could stop her from making a terrible mistake. If she married someone, sounds like her name's not Voss anymore." Silas's jaw tightened. "I want to speak with her, make sure she's all right, that she understands the position she's put herself in." "Position being what exactly?" "She's attached herself to a man nobody knows, living in isolation where anything could happen to her. Her fiancé's family, my family, feels responsible for her well-being, even after she rejected our offer of support." "Support." Gideon said the word like it tasted bad. "That what you call abandoning her at the church, making her a laughingstock, then expecting her to be grateful when you deign to check on her? I see she's filled your head with her version of events. I was there, saw how your town treated her. Don't need her version when I witnessed yours." Silas dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. "Look, I'm not here to argue about what happened in Black Hollow. I'm here because a woman under our family's protection disappeared with a stranger, and we need to verify she's safe. Surely you can understand that concern." "She's safe." "I prefer to hear that from her directly." "Would you now?" Gideon's voice went colder. "And if she tells you she's fine, you'll ride off and leave us alone? If I'm satisfied she's here of her own free will and not being coerced or misled, then yes, that's all I'm asking." Inside the cabin, Alara felt her hands shaking. She'd heard that tone from Silas before, reasonable on the surface, concealing something harder underneath. He hadn't ridden 3 days into the mountains out of concern for her well-being. He wanted something else, something he wasn't admitting yet. But she also knew that refusing to speak with him would only make things worse, would give him ammunition to claim she was being held against her will, that Gideon was dangerous, that intervention was necessary. She handed the pistol to Caleb. "If anything goes wrong, you take Maisie and run to the barn. Hide in the loft until either Gideon or I come get you. Understand? Yes, ma'am. Alara stepped outside before she could convince herself not to. Gideon turned, surprised, but she walked past him to face Silas directly. I'm here, she said, and I'm fine. Silas studied her for a long moment. She knew what he saw: rough clothes, work-worn hands, hair braided simply instead of styled. She looked nothing like the woman who'd waited in that church, dressed in borrowed finery and desperate hope. Alara, it's good to see you well. Is it? Of course. We've all been worried about you. Worried enough to help when I needed it? Or just worried now that I've found help elsewhere? His expression flickered, annoyance breaking through the polite mask. You can't possibly think this is better than what we offered. Samuel would have married you eventually, once his uncle finished convincing him I wasn't good enough, you mean? Once you'd broken me down enough that I'd accept whatever scraps your family decided to throw my way. That's not... We wanted what was best for everyone involved. You wanted what was best for Samuel and your family's reputation. I just happened to be inconvenient to those plans. She crossed her arms, fighting to keep her voice steady. Now you've ridden 3 days into the mountains to check on me. Why? What do you really want? Silas glanced at Gideon, then back to Alara. Could we speak privately? No. This is family business. I'm not family. You made that very clear. And Gideon is my husband. Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of him. Silas's mouth tightened, but he apparently decided to change tactics. Fine. I came because there are legal matters to discuss. Questions about property rights in this valley, water access, grazing boundaries. Questions that affect everyone living up here, including you and your husband. Gideon stepped forward. What questions? My family owns substantial land holdings throughout this territory. We're in the process of consolidating those holdings, ensuring proper legal documentation for everything we control. Part of that process involves surveying existing homesteads, verifying their claims, making sure boundaries are properly established. My claim is filed and paid for. Have the papers to prove it. I'm sure you do, but surveys can be complicated, particularly in areas where water rights overlap, where multiple parties might have legitimate claims to the same resources. Silas pulled a folded document from his coat. I'm prepared to offer a fair price for your homestead. More than fair, actually. Enough to start fresh somewhere else. Somewhere less isolated. Not interested. You haven't heard the price. Don't need to. This land is mine. Silas's polite expression cracked further. Be reasonable. You're one man with a family to support, barely surviving up here. I'm offering you a way out, a chance to... To what? Clear out so you can expand your holdings without dealing with inconvenient neighbors? Gideon's voice stayed level, but his hands had shifted on the rifle. I've met men like you before, Granger. Men who think enough money means they get to decide what happens to everyone around them. I'm trying to help you avoid problems down the road. By taking my land. By offering you a fair deal before circumstances force a less pleasant resolution. The threat hung in the air between them, naked despite Silas's attempts to dress it in reasonable language. Alara felt her stomach clench. You need to leave, she said clearly. Now. Silas looked at her, and she saw genuine anger there for the first time. You're making a mistake, Alara. Both of you are. This valley is changing, whether you like it or not. Men who cooperate will prosper. Men who stand in the way will be what? Gideon interrupted. Say it clearly instead of dancing around it. For a moment, Alara thought Silas might actually answer honestly, but he collected himself, smoothing his features back into false pleasantness. Will find themselves facing legal challenges and financial pressures they're unprepared for. That's all I meant. He looked between them one last time. I'll give you a week to reconsider. After that, I'll have to proceed with other options. I'd prefer this to be amicable, but I will protect my family's interests one way or another. He mounted his horse, turned it toward the trail. Before riding off, he looked back at Alara. You could have had an easy life, could have had security, comfort, a place in society. Instead, you chose this. He gestured at the rough homestead, his contempt clear. I hope it's worth what it's going to cost you. Then he rode away, leaving nothing but the echo of hoofbeats and the weight of his threats hanging over everything they'd built. Gideon stood watching the trail long after Silas disappeared, his rifle still gripped tight enough that his knuckles showed white. Alara wanted to say something reassuring, but every word that formed in her mind felt hollow against the weight of what had just happened. "He'll be back," Gideon said finally, "and he won't come alone next time." "What are we going to do?" "First thing, talk to the other homesteaders in the valley. Find out if Granger's been visiting them too, making the same offers." He turned to face her. "Second thing, make sure our land claim is documented properly, that there's no legal angle he can use to force us out. And if there is, then we find another way to fight." Caleb emerged from the cabin, still holding the pistol Alara had given him. "Is he gone?" "For now," Gideon said. He held out his hand for the weapon, checked it carefully before setting the safety. "You did good, keeping your sister safe." "I wasn't scared," Caleb said, though the tremor in his voice suggested otherwise. "Being scared and doing what needs doing anyway, that's called courage. Your pa would be proud of that too." Over the next 3 days, Gideon visited every homestead within a day's ride. He came back with news that confirmed what they'd suspected. Silas Granger had been making rounds through the valley for weeks, offering to buy out smaller claims, pressuring families who couldn't afford legal fights or didn't have the strength to resist organized harassment. Some had already sold and left. Others were considering it, worn down by the combination of hard living and harder threats. A few, like a stubborn old trapper named Marcus and a widow named Sarah who ran her dead husband's claim with fierce determination, were refusing to budge. "Sarah says Granger's men have been letting her cattle loose," Gideon told Alara that night after the children had gone to sleep. "Has to spend hours rounding them up, loses work time, stresses the animals. Marcus had traps destroyed, whole seasons' worth of furs stolen from his cache. They're not even hiding it? Why would they? Who's going to stop them? Nearest law is in Timber Ridge, and the sheriff there won't ride 3 days into the mountains for property disputes between homesteaders and rich men, especially when the rich man probably has him on payroll." Alara felt anger building in her chest, hot and bitter. "So they just get to push people out? Take whatever they want? Oh, that's how it works when you have money and power and no conscience about using them." Gideon stared into the fire. "But there's something else. Marcus heard rumors that Granger's not just buying land for expansion. He's planning something bigger, wants to control water access through the whole valley, charge fees for using streams that cross his property, turn independent homesteaders into tenants paying for the privilege of surviving on land they own." "That's insane. The water rights up here. People have been using those streams for decades." "Which is why he needs to own enough land to make it enforceable, control the choke points, and suddenly everyone downstream needs his permission to irrigate crops or water livestock." Gideon's jaw tightened. "It's smart, if you're the kind of person who thinks that way. Cruel, but smart." "What did you tell the others?" "Told them we should organize, present a united front, make it clear we're not going to be pushed around individually." He looked at her. "They want to meet here tomorrow night, all of them, the ones still resisting at least. Figure out if there's a way to fight this that doesn't end with all of us losing everything." The next evening, 8 people crowded into the cabin that suddenly felt much smaller. Marcus came with his 2 grown sons, both of them lean and hard from years of wilderness living. Sarah brought her teenage daughter, a girl with her mother's fierce eyes and dirt under her fingernails from a day's work. There were 2 brothers who ran a small lumber operation, and an older couple who'd been homesteading longer than anyone and had stories of the valley before Granger's family started expanding their claims. Gideon laid out what they knew: the pattern of harassment, the legal pressures, the rumors about water rights. The group listened with expressions ranging from anger to resignation to stubborn determination not to be moved. "We should fight," one of Marcus's sons said immediately. "Run his men off when they come onto our land. Make it too expensive for him to keep pushing." "That'll get us all arrested or killed," Sarah countered. "Granger's got money for lawyers, for hired guns. We start shooting, and we give him exactly the excuse he needs to bring in the law against us." "So we just roll over?" "I didn't say that." She looked around the room. "But we need to be smarter than him, not just angrier." "How do we outsmart a man with that much money?" the older woman asked quietly. "We're barely surviving up here as it is." "We pool resources," Alara said. Everyone turned to look at her, and she felt her face flush but pushed forward anyway. "Individually, he can pick us off. But together, if we're sharing labor, trading supplies, helping each other through the hard times, we become harder to break. That's pretty words, one of the lumber brothers said skeptically. But it doesn't solve the land claim problem. If he's got legal standing to challenge our homesteads,
Then we make sure he doesn't, Gideon interrupted. We ride to Timber Ridge together, all of us, and file every document we need to reinforce our claims. We get everything on record, clear and legal, so there's no ambiguity he can exploit. That's a week's travel for some of us. We can't all leave our homesteads unattended. We rotate. Half go first, secure their claims. Half stay and watch over everyone's property. Then we switch. Gideon leaned forward. And in the meantime, we help each other survive. Marcus, you've got the best trap lines in the valley. You teach the rest of us your routes. Share the hunting grounds. Sarah, your crops always come in strong. You help others improve their yields. We stop competing and start cooperating. You make it sound simple, Marcus said. But we've all been doing this alone for a reason. Easier to trust yourself than count on neighbors. Maybe that worked when we were just fighting the wilderness, Alara said. But now we're fighting something worse. And alone, we lose. All of us. Silence fell over the group. Outside, a coyote called out, lonely and distant. Maisie stirred in the bedroom but didn't wake. The fire crackled between them while everyone processed what was being proposed. I'm in, Sarah said finally. I've already lost too much to these bastards. If there's a chance this works, I'll take it. Us too, the older couple agreed. We're too old to start over somewhere else anyway. Slowly, the others nodded agreement. Not enthusiastically. This wasn't a plan that inspired confidence, just one that felt slightly less doomed than the alternatives. They spent the next 2 hours working out details. Who would travel to Timber Ridge first, how they'd coordinate protection of unattended homesteads, what resources each family could share. Caleb listened from the corner, absorbing every word with the intensity of someone learning lessons that might save his life someday. When everyone finally left, disappearing into the darkness toward their scattered homes, Alara started cleaning up the cabin while Gideon checked the perimeter one more time. She was washing cups when he came back inside, barring the door behind him. That was good, what you said, he told her. About cooperation being our strength. You've got a way of making people listen. I just said what seemed obvious. Nothing's obvious when you're scared and angry and trying to survive. You gave them hope. That's worth something. She set down the cup she'd been washing. Do you think it'll work? Really? I think it's our best chance, maybe our only chance. He moved to stand beside her. But even if we do everything right, this could still end badly. Granger's got resources we can't match. If he decides to escalate, then we deal with it. She was surprised by the certainty in her own voice. I'm tired of running from things, Gideon. Tired of letting other people decide what happens to my life. This isn't like standing up to a town's gossip. This is dangerous. I know. She met his eyes. But for the first time in my life, I've got something worth fighting for. This place, these children, this... She gestured at the cabin around them. Whatever this is that we've built, I'm not letting someone with money and threats take it away because we're easier to push around than we are to respect. Something shifted in Gideon's expression, something warm and complicated that he looked away from before she could fully read it. We should get some sleep. Tomorrow starts the hard work. But neither of them moved for a long moment, standing there in the quiet cabin while everything they'd built together hung in the balance between survival and loss. The next 2 weeks were harder than any winter work they'd done. Gideon and Marcus's sons made the first trip to Timber Ridge with their land documents, riding hard to get there and back quickly. While they were gone, Alara and Sarah coordinated protection of the temporarily unattended homesteads, moving between properties to check on livestock and watch for signs of interference. Caleb went with her, carrying supplies and learning the trails between each claim. Maisie stayed with Sarah's daughter, the two of them becoming fast friends over shared chores and whispered confidences. It wasn't ideal, splitting the family up even temporarily, but it was necessary. On the third day, they found evidence of tampering at Marcus's place. His gate had been deliberately broken, his water barrel punctured to leak out slowly. Nothing catastrophic, just expensive and time-consuming to fix. Exactly the kind of harassment designed to wear people down. They're watching us, Caleb said quietly, looking around the empty homestead. Waiting for us to be alone or scattered. Probably,
Alara finished repairing the water barrel with materials she'd brought specifically for this kind of sabotage. But they're also learning we're not alone anymore. Every time they damage something, we fix it together. Eventually, that has to mean something. Or eventually they escalate to something we can't fix. She looked at the boy, saw the old soul behind his young eyes. He'd learned too much about the world's cruelty too fast. But he was still here, still fighting. That had to count for something too. When Gideon's group returned from Timber Ridge, they brought mixed news. The land claims were properly filed and documented, which gave them legal standing. But the clerk had warned them that Silas Granger had hired lawyers who were already preparing challenges, looking for any technical error or ambiguity they could exploit in court. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked at the next gathering. "Months, maybe. Long enough to get through summer and into next winter." Gideon laid out a rough map he'd drawn of the valley. "But here's what I learned while we were there. Granger doesn't just want our land. He needs it. There's railroad surveyors scouting routes through this region, and the valley is a natural corridor. He's betting on the railroad coming through, wants to own enough property that he can negotiate exclusive contracts, charge whatever he wants for right-of-way access." "How much is that worth?" one of the lumber brothers asked. "Enough to retire rich 3 times over. Enough to turn this whole valley into company land where we all work for wages instead of owning our own futures." The room fell silent again, processing the scale of what they were up against. This wasn't just a land grab by a greedy neighbor. This was calculated theft in preparation for massive profits, with all of them standing in the way of someone who viewed their lives as inconvenient obstacles. "Then we make ourselves expensive obstacles," Marcus said grimly. "Every delay costs him money. Every day we hold out increases the chance the railroad chooses a different route, or his investors get nervous, or something breaks in our favor." "That's a lot of chance to bet our homes on," the older woman said. "You got a better plan?" She didn't answer, because none of them did. Summer arrived with shocking speed, the high valley transforming from snow-covered isolation into something almost beautiful. Wildflowers bloomed across the meadows. The stream ran clear and cold. Wildlife returned in abundance. If not for the constant tension of waiting for Granger's next move, it might have been the best time any of them had known in these mountains. The children thrived. Caleb shot up 3 inches and started needing larger clothes, his boy's frame beginning to show the muscle from constant physical work. Maisie learned to read simple books Alara borrowed from Sarah, sounding out words with fierce concentration. Both of them called the cabin home without hesitation now, and called Gideon and Alara Mama and Papa in the casual way that stopped making Alara's chest ache and just started feeling right. The valley's families fell into routines of cooperation that slowly became natural. Sarah taught Alara and 2 other women how to preserve summer vegetables for winter. Marcus shared hunting grounds and trapline knowledge that improved everyone's meat supply. The lumber brothers helped repair buildings across multiple homesteads in exchange for help with their logging operation. It felt like building something real, something that might last. Then August came, and with it the first real attack. It started with fire. Not the accidental kind, not lightning strikes or careless embers. Deliberate fires set at 3 different homesteads on the same night. The 2 lumber brothers' main cabin, Sarah's largest barn, and Marcus's storage shed where he kept his furs. Gideon smelled the smoke first, waking Alara in the middle of the night with a hand over her mouth to keep her quiet. "Get the children," he whispered. "Something's burning." She threw on clothes and woke Caleb and Maisie while Gideon grabbed weapons and headed outside. The night sky glowed orange in 3 directions, distant but unmistakable. He stood in the yard, calculating distances and directions, his face set in hard lines. "We have to help them," Alara said, joining him with the pistol he'd taught her to use. "We will, but first we make sure this isn't meant to draw us away from here so they can hit us while we're gone." He was right to be cautious. They found 2 men near their barn, carrying torches and cans of lamp oil. Gideon's warning shot sent them running before they could light anything, but the message was clear. Every homestead had been targeted simultaneously, designed to create maximum chaos and damage. They rode for Sarah's place first since it was closest. Her barn was fully engulfed by the time they arrived, flames shooting high into the night sky. Sarah and her daughter were trying to save what livestock they could, driving panicked animals away from the heat while the building collapsed in on itself with roars and showers of sparks. Gideon and Caleb helped with the animals, while Ilara and Maisie carried water to douse spot fires before they could spread to other structures. By dawn, the barn was gone, reduced to smoking ruins and destroyed equipment. Sarah stood staring at the wreckage with tears tracking through soot on her face. "That was everything," she said quietly. "All my winter hay, my tools, my—" Her voice broke. "I can't rebuild that. I don't have the money or materials or time before winter comes again." "We'll help," Ilara said immediately. "With what? You barely have enough for yourselves." "Then we'll figure it out. Together." They rode to check on Marcus next. His shed was destroyed, but he'd managed to save most of his furs, dragging them out before the building was fully consumed. The Lumber brothers had lost their cabin and were living in their mill building, crowded and miserable but alive. Everyone gathered at Gideon and Ilara's homestead that afternoon, exhausted and frightened and angry. The scale of the attack had shocked them. This was beyond harassment, beyond pressure. This was assault, deliberate and coordinated. "He's trying to break us all at once," Marcus said, his voice rough from smoke inhalation. "Hit us hard enough that we can't recover, force us to sell out or abandon our claims." "Did anyone see the men who did it?" Gideon asked. "Too dark. Moved too fast. But it was professional. They knew what they were doing, how to set fires that would burn hot and spread fast." Sarah coughed, wincing. This wasn't random travelers or desperate homesteaders. These were hired men doing a job. "Then we need to hire protection," one of the Lumber brothers said. "Find men willing to stand guard, fight back if necessary." "With what money?" his brother countered. "We just lost our cabin. Sarah lost her barn. Marcus lost his shed. We're all bleeding resources trying to survive, and you want us to pay for guards?" "I'll stand guard," Caleb said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at him. "I can shoot. I can stay awake at night. I can watch for trouble." "You're a child," Marcus said, not unkindly. "I'm the child whose parents burned to death while people decided whether they were worth saving." Caleb's voice stayed steady, despite the weight of what he was saying. "I'm not going to let it happen to anyone else, because we waited too long to fight back." Gideon put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's brave. But this isn't your fight to lead. It's everyone's fight now. You said so yourself. We survive together, or we all lose." The adults exchanged glances, uncomfortable with the 10-year-old speaking truths they'd been avoiding. But Ilara saw something else in their faces, too. Respect for the boy's courage, recognition that he'd already survived more than most of them could imagine. "He's right about one thing," she said. "We're past the point of hoping this resolves itself. Granger's escalated to violence. We need to respond, or we're just victims waiting for him to finish destroying us." "What kind of response?" Sarah asked. "We already established we can't match him violence for violence." "No, but we can make this public. Get word to newspapers in Timber Ridge, maybe even Helena. Make noise about what's happening up here." Ilara looked around at the group. Rich men hate public scrutiny. If we turn this into a story about wealthy landowners burning out families with children, maybe that brings pressure he's not prepared for. "And if it doesn't?" the older woman asked. "If he just moves faster, hits harder, finishes us off before any newspaper cares? Then at least we tried something other than waiting to lose." They argued for another hour, fear and anger and desperation mixing together into plans that kept falling apart under scrutiny. Finally, they agreed to 3 things. They'd send someone to Timber Ridge to find a newspaper willing to cover the story. They'd coordinate night watches across all homesteads so no one was alone and vulnerable. And they'd document every instance of harassment or violence in case legal action ever became possible. It wasn't much, but it was something. That night, lying in bed with Maisie curled against her side, Ilara heard Gideon moving around in the main room. She got up carefully to avoid waking the girl and found him sitting by the window, rifle across his lap, watching the darkness. "You can't stay awake every night," she said quietly. "Can't sleep knowing they might come back either." She sat beside him, pulling a blanket around her shoulders against the night's chill. "What happened to us, Gideon? A few months ago we were just trying to survive winter. Now we're in the middle of some kind of war we didn't ask for." "That's what happens when you have something worth taking. Other people notice and decide they want it more than you deserve it." "I'm scared." "Good. Means you're paying attention." He looked at her. "But scared doesn't mean helpless. We've got resources now, people we can count on, plans we can try, children who need us to be stronger than we feel. Is that enough? Guess we'll find out." They sat together through the darkest part of night, taking comfort in shared vigilance. When Maisie cried out from a nightmare, Alara went to calm her. When Caleb woke and couldn't fall back asleep, Gideon took him outside to check the perimeter, teaching him patrol patterns and how to read disturbed earth for signs of intruders. They were becoming a family in the way that mattered most, learning to protect each other not because it was easy, but because the alternative was unthinkable. A week later, Marcus's oldest son rode back from Timber Ridge with mixed news. He'd found a journalist willing to write about the valley's situation, a young man who apparently had a reputation for antagonizing powerful families on behalf of struggling settlers. But the journalist wanted to visit the valley personally, see the damage, interview families. He'd arrive in 2 weeks. 2 weeks is a long time, Sarah said when they gathered to hear the news. A lot can happen in 2 weeks. She was right. 4 days later, Gideon was checking the northern trapline when he found fresh tracks, multiple horses, moving through the forest in a pattern that suggested scouting rather than traveling. He followed the tracks carefully, his rifle ready, and discovered a camp hidden in a ravine about 3 miles from the nearest homestead. 5 men, all armed, clearly prepared for a longer stay than a casual visit would require. They had supplies for at least a week, and maps spread out that showed every homestead in the valley, marked with notes he couldn't read from his hidden position. Gideon retreated carefully, memorizing everything he'd seen. When he got back to the cabin, he called an emergency gathering. Everyone who could travel came within hours, crowding into the space that was becoming their unofficial meeting hall. They're preparing for something big, he told them. 5 armed men camping in the valley, studying our positions. That's not harassment, that's planning an assault. When? Marcus asked. Soon. They wouldn't camp this long unless they're ready to move. Then we need to move first, Caleb said. Hit them before they hit us. That's exactly what they want, Sarah countered. Give them an excuse to claim self-defense, turn us into the aggressors. We can't just wait to be attacked. No, but we can be smart about it. Gideon pulled out his rough map again. We evacuate the most vulnerable homesteads, get everyone to defensible positions. We set watches, real ones with multiple people so no one's caught alone. And we document everything. If they attack, we make sure there are witnesses, evidence that proves we were defending ourselves. And if they burn us out while we're all huddled together, one of the Lumber brothers asked, then at least we go down fighting instead of being picked off one by one. They spent the rest of the day coordinating the evacuation. The older couple moved in with Sarah. Marcus and his sons fortified their homestead into something more defensible. The Lumber brothers joined Gideon's household, bringing weapons and supplies. The cabin became crowded and tense, everyone jumping at unexpected sounds, exhaustion settling over them like a weight. Caleb and Maisie sensed the adults' fear, becoming quiet and clingy. Alara tried to maintain some normalcy, still teaching letters, still preparing meals, still tucking them in with stories, but the pretense grew harder every day. On the 9th day, a rider appeared on the trail. Not one of Granger's men, the journalist from Timber Ridge, arriving earlier than expected. His name was Thomas Welker, and he was younger than Alara had imagined, maybe 25, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that missed nothing. He spent 2 days interviewing everyone, documenting the damage, taking photographs with equipment he'd hauled all the way from town. He listened to their stories with a focus that made even the most skeptical homesteaders believe he might actually care about what happened to them. This is damning, he said on the second evening, reviewing his notes. A clear pattern of harassment escalating to violence, all targeting families who refused to sell out to a single buyer. The timing with the railroad surveys makes the motive obvious. If I can get this published in Helena, maybe even picked up by Eastern papers. If, Sarah interrupted, that's a lot of hope to rest on one article. It's pressure Granger's not expecting, Thomas argued. Men like him rely on operating in shadows, where no one's paying attention. Dragging this into daylight might make his investors nervous, or give territorial authorities a reason to actually investigate. Or it might just make him move faster before the story can damage him, Marcus said grimly. Thomas had no answer for that because they all knew it was true. He left the next morning, his saddlebags full of documentation and photographs, promising to work fast. They watched him ride away with a mixture of hope and dread, knowing they'd just committed themselves to a course of action they couldn't take back. That night, the attack came. Not with fire this time, with armed men on horseback, 8 of them, riding into the valley during the darkest hours with torches and weapons and clear intent to destroy whatever resistance they found. Gideon's watch spotted them first, the Lumber Brothers taking the midnight shift, positioned where they could see the main trail. Their warning shots woke the entire household, sending everyone scrambling for weapons and defensive positions they'd practiced but hoped never to use. Elara grabbed Maisie and pulled her into the root cellar beneath the cabin, the hiding place they'd prepared for exactly this situation. The girl was crying, terrified by the gunshots and shouting, but Elara held her tight and whispered the same words over and over. "You're safe. I've got you. You're safe." Above them, the fighting started in earnest. Gideon and the Lumber Brothers fired from behind cover, aiming for horses and trying to break up the attackers' formation without killing anyone if possible. Caleb loaded weapons with hands that shook but didn't fumble, learning under fire what he'd only practiced in daylight. Marcus and his sons arrived within minutes, drawn by the sound of conflict, and suddenly the defenders outnumbered their attackers. The hired men hadn't expected real resistance. They'd been told they were hitting isolated, scared families, easy targets. Instead, they found organized defense, people willing to shoot back, a cohesion that turned their planned assault into a confused retreat. One of the attackers went down with a bullet in his leg. 2 more lost their horses and had to run on foot. The rest scattered into the darkness, regrouping somewhere beyond rifle range. In the sudden silence after the gunfire stopped, Elara heard her own heartbeat pounding and Maisie's quiet sobbing. She held the girl tighter, listening to Gideon's voice calling the all clear, waiting for the terror to recede enough that she could move again. When she finally climbed out of the cellar, she found the yard transformed into a battlefield. Horses scattered, blood on the ground, bullet holes in the cabin walls. The wounded attacker lay near the barn, Marcus standing over him with a rifle while Sarah tied his hands. "He's lucky he's still breathing," Marcus said coldly. "Another foot to the right, and that shot would have killed him." Gideon was checking on everyone, making sure no one on their side was hurt. Caleb sat against the fence, his hands still shaking from adrenaline. The Lumber Brothers were reloading weapons, their faces grim but satisfied. "They'll be back," one of them said. "More of them next time, better prepared." "Let them come," Marcus said. "We held them off once. We can do it again." But Elara saw the exhaustion in everyone's faces, the understanding that this was just the beginning. They'd won a single fight, not the war, and every defense would be harder than the last as Granger escalated his attacks. The wounded man wouldn't talk at first, claiming he was just passing through and got caught up in confusion. But Marcus had a way of asking questions that made silence uncomfortable. And eventually, he admitted he'd been hired by Silas Granger's foreman to discourage squatters from staying in the valley. "Discourage," Sarah repeated flatly. "That what he called it when he told you to attack families with children in the middle of the night? Didn't say nothing about children, just said make it clear they weren't welcome, that staying would be expensive." The man looked at his bleeding leg. "I need a doctor." "Nearest one's 3 days' ride. You'll live that long if the wound doesn't get infected." Gideon crouched beside him. "You tell your boss what happened here. Tell him we're not moving. Tell him every attack makes us stronger because we're done standing alone. He'll just send more men who won't be as careful about who gets hurt. Then we'll be ready for them too." They kept the wounded man in the barn overnight, under guard, then sent him back to Granger the next morning with bandages and just enough supplies to make it to town. A message and a warning wrapped in survival. The Valley families gathered again that afternoon, comparing damage and checking on each other. No one on their side had been seriously hurt, a miracle given the chaos of the fight. But everyone was exhausted, nerves frayed, patience for Granger's campaign worn down to nothing. "We can't keep doing this," the older woman said. "My heart can't take another night like that." "Then what's the alternative?" Sarah asked. "Sell out and lose everything we've built? Maybe losing everything is better than dying for it." No one had an answer to that. They dispersed slowly, each family retreating to their damaged homesteads to try to salvage what they could from wreckage and fear. That night, Elara sat with Gideon by the fire while the children slept fitfully in the bedroom. Neither of them spoke for a long time, just sat together in the aftermath of violence, trying to process how quickly their lives had transformed from difficult but manageable to genuinely dangerous. "I keep thinking about what Silas said," Elara said finally, "about me choosing this over an easy life.
part of me wonders if he was right. If I made a mistake dragging you and these children into something that might get us all killed. You didn't drag anyone anywhere. I chose to offer you a way out of that town. The children chose to come here instead of dying in the wilderness. We all chose this, knowing it would be hard. But we didn't know it would be this. No, but now that it is, we're still choosing it. Every day we stay, every fight we take, that's a choice. He looked at her. Question is whether you still want to choose it, knowing what we're up against. Elara thought about the cabin around them, rough but warm. About Maisie calling her mama without hesitation. About Caleb growing into someone who'd fight for what mattered instead of running from what scared him. About this impossible valley full of stubborn people who'd somehow become her family. Yes, she said, I still choose this. Even if we lose, especially then, because losing after fighting for something real feels better than winning at something empty. She turned to face him fully. I spent my whole life before this being chosen or not chosen by other people. This is the first time I've gotten to choose for myself, and I'm choosing to stay. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Gideon reached out and took her hand, his grip rough from work but steady. Together then. Outside, an owl called out somewhere in the darkness. The fire burned low, casting shadows that danced and swayed. And two people who'd started as strangers, born from desperation, sat holding on to each other while the world they'd built together hung in the balance between courage and catastrophe. The journalist's article hit the Helena newspaper 6 days later, and the territory exploded with attention. Thomas Welker had written with raw honesty that made people uncomfortable, detailing the widow fighting for her dead husband's dream, the orphaned children who'd survived one fire already, the desperate marriage that had become worth defending. He'd named Silas Granger specifically, detailed his expanding holdings, questioned whether railroad surveys justified forced removal of established families. The photographs showed burned buildings and frightened faces that couldn't be dismissed as lies. Word reached them through Marcus's writer, breathless and waving the newspaper. It's everywhere. People are talking. Some say Granger's gone too far. The territorial governor sent someone to ask questions. And the others? Sarah asked. Say homesteaders are squatters who deserve what they get. He set the newspaper down. But Granger's lawyers look nervous. Gideon read quickly. This might work. Not because it changes his mind. Men like him don't change, but it makes him visible. Or desperate, Marcus said. Cornered animals are dangerous. Both were right. 2 days later, Silas returned with lawyers, a surveyor, and a land office representative. No guns this time, just legal authority designed to intimidate through documentation most homesteaders couldn't understand. They set up near Gideon's cabin, spreading papers across tables, summoning families to review claims individually. The process was meant to crush them. Formal language, references to statutes, implications that filing errors could invalidate years of residence. The surveyor explained boundaries were disputed. The lawyer spoke about water rights held by Granger's family for decades, the cost of litigation, the years of fighting, the likelihood of losing to better-funded opponents. Or, Silas said pleasantly, we settle reasonably. Fair prices for your claims. You start fresh somewhere less complicated. We want our homes, Elara said. Homes you may not legally own. Silas gestured at papers. I'm saving you years of heartbreak. Funny how your concern shows up right after the newspaper made you look like a villain, Gideon said. Silas's expression cracked. That article was sensationalist nonsense, but it's made certain parties nervous, which means I need proper legal channels instead of other means. You mean instead of burning us out? I have surveyors' reports, precedents, lawyers who will tie you up for years. He pulled out a bank draft. Or you take $1,500 and walk away clean. $1,500 was more than they'd ever seen. Enough to start over somewhere easier. Give the children security, education, opportunities beyond survival. Gideon looked at it long, then at Elara. No, he said, we're not selling. Every family gave the same answer. They were staying. Silas left frustrated, his legal strategy failing like his violent one. But his final words carried weight. The railroad will come through. I will control this valley. You're wasting years fighting the inevitable. He looked at Elara. I hope your pride is worth what it costs everyone who depends on you. After he left, families gathered again. The older woman cried,
overwhelmed by legal complexities. Sarah looked exhausted. Even Marcus seemed subdued. "We need real help," the older man said. "Someone who understands law." "With what money?" a lumber brother asked. But Thomas Welker's article had attracted attention from a Helena law firm specializing in homestead rights. They'd review the valley's situation, possibly work on contingency if claims were strong enough. The lawyers arrived 3 weeks later, Henry Carver and Margaret Shaw. They spent a week reviewing documents, measuring boundaries, interviewing families. "You've got a case," Henry said finally. "Not perfect. There are legitimate boundary questions, but the harassment pattern, the timing with railroad surveys, the documented violence, we can work with that." "What kind of case?" Marcus asked. "That this is land theft disguised as legal process, that Granger's using technicalities to mask a hostile takeover." Margaret spread a marked map. "We fight him in court and public opinion. Make it expensive. Make investors nervous." "How long?" Sarah asked. "Months minimum. Maybe years." "We don't have years." "Then we make him settle faster, file countersuits for fraud and harassment, get an injunction preventing interference, make more noise publicly, make fighting you more expensive than settling." "And if that doesn't work?" Gideon asked. "Trial. Hope the judge values homestead rights over corporate expansion." Henry's face was serious. "I won't lie. This is hard. He has resources we don't, but you've got something he can't buy. Moral high ground, and people willing to fight for what's right instead of what's profitable." The lawsuit crawled forward with painful slowness. Documents filed, responses submitted, motions argued. Thomas wrote follow-ups, keeping pressure on Granger's image. Meanwhile, life continued with strange duality, preparing for court while managing daily survival. Summer faded into fall. Families worked together preparing for winter, this time with shared resources that lightened everyone's burden. Caleb turned 11, shoulders broadening from work. Maisie learned to write her name, started teaching other valley children. The homestead became the resistance's center, where people gathered to coordinate strategy. And somewhere in all that, without quite noticing when, Gideon and Alara's practical arrangement stopped being practical. Small things first, reaching for each other's hands without thinking, leaning into each other when exhaustion made standing alone impossible, moving around the cabin with unconscious coordination of people who knew each other perfectly. The children noticed first. Maisie called them Mama and Papa like they were one unit. Caleb stopped asking when things would change. Sarah said it out loud, visiting one afternoon. "You know you're in love with him, right?" Alara nearly dropped the laundry. "What?" "You heard me. You look at him like he's air and you're drowning." We're not, it's practical." "Was practical, past tense." Sarah handed her another shirt. "Now it's something else, and you're both too stubborn to admit it." That conversation haunted Alara for days. She watched Gideon with new awareness, the way his face softened with Maisie, the pride in his voice with Caleb, the careful way he made sure Alara ate enough, rested enough, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. She was still figuring out how to address it when winter arrived early, trapping them inside for 3 days. On the second night, after children finally slept, silence grew too heavy. "Sarah thinks I'm in love with you," Alara said, words escaping before she could stop them. Gideon went still. "What?" "She said it weeks ago. I've been thinking since." Alara kept her eyes on the fire. "I think she's right." Silence stretched. She finally looked. He stared at her with shock and something unidentifiable. "That wasn't part of the arrangement," he said. "I know. You were supposed to decide in spring if you'd stay. That was the deal. Spring came and went. I decided." She faced him fully. "Not because of the arrangement, because somewhere between surviving and fighting and raising these children, this stopped being about convenience, about wanting this life with you specifically, not just with anyone who'd have me." Gideon stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "You don't know what you're saying." "I do." "You're grateful. That's different." "Don't tell me what I feel." Anger mixed with vulnerability. "I spent my life having others tell me what I felt, what I should want, what I was worth. I'm done. I know what I feel, and I'm telling you in case—" She stopped. "In case what?" "In case you feel it too, and we're both too scared to admit it." He turned. face working through emotions she'd never seen. I can't. When I lost my brother, I told myself I'd never care that much again. Being alone was safer. Then I watched you in that church, surrounded by people who decided you were worthless, and something broke. I couldn't leave you there. That's not an answer. I know. He moved closer. I'm terrified, Alara. Terrified I'll fail you like I failed him. Terrified that caring this much means I'll have more to lose when everything falls apart. What if it doesn't? It always does. Then we build anyway. She took his hand, because the alternative is not building anything, not caring about anyone, dying slowly alone. That's not surviving. He looked at their joined hands. I don't know how to do this. Neither do I. But we've figured out everything else together. He pulled her close then, desperate strength speaking louder than words. Alara pressed against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, feeling tension leave his shoulders as he accepted what they'd been avoiding. I love you, he said roughly. Don't know when exactly, but somewhere between that church and now, you became what I'm most afraid to lose. Then don't lose me. Fight for this like we're fighting for the valley. I intend to. The lawsuit reached critical point in late November. The judge ordered mediation before trial, sitting across from Silas and lawyers trying to find compromise nobody wanted. Valley families filled the mediator's office with solidarity born from shared suffering. Henry and Margaret laid out their case, documented harassment, violence patterns, evidence that Granger's claims were weapons rather than legitimate grievances. Granger's lawyers countered with surveys and prior claims, technical arguments about water rights that would take years to resolve. Seems to me, the mediator said finally, you've both got legitimate concerns and neither's entirely wrong. Mr. Granger, your family has prior water access claims. But these homesteaders have established residency and improvements. You can't erase years of labor because you want consolidation. They're squatting on land my family has legal interests in, Silas said coldly, and you're strong-arming people off homes. Neither sustainable. The mediator looked between them. My recommendation? Mr. Granger reduces claims to boundaries predating homesteads. Families acknowledge shared water rights. Both drop harassment claims. Everyone stops bleeding money on fees. Unacceptable, Silas said. I need the entire valley for railroad development. Then prove in court your need overrides their established claims. Judge Matthews doesn't favor wealthy landowners displacing families without clear cause. The mediator closed his folder. This is your chance to settle reasonably. Mediation broke after 2 more hours, neither side giving enough ground. But something shifted. Granger's lawyers looked worried, exchanging glances suggesting they weren't confident about trial. Walking out, Henry pulled them aside. He'll settle. Maybe not today, but soon. His lawyers know they're on shaky ground. The longer this drags, the worse his image gets. The offer came 3 weeks later. Formal recognition of all established homesteads with improvements, shared water rights with written agreements, enough land concessions for railroad development without displacing families. In exchange, families would drop harassment claims, agree not to expand beyond current boundaries, acknowledge Granger's control of unclaimed valley land. Not everything they wanted, but enough. The valley gathered one last time to vote. Debate lasted hours, weighing security of recognized claims against bitterness of compromising with someone who'd tried to destroy them. I don't want to give him anything, Sarah said, after what he did. But if we don't settle, we could lose everything in court, the older woman countered, with restrictions, like we're tenants. You're owners with guaranteed rights, Margaret clarified. The language is clear, homesteads recognized, claims valid. Boundaries and water agreements are normal. You're not giving up ownership, just agreeing to coexist. They voted by raising hands, everyone visible to everyone else, no hiding from the decision's weight. One by one, hands rose, reluctantly, painfully, steadily. Gideon looked at Alara first, silent conversation passing between them. Yes, Gideon said, raising his hand. We accept. Alara raised hers beside him. Settlement finalized 2 weeks before Christmas. Papers signed in the territorial office, transforming hard-fought existence into legal reality. Silas signed too, treating it like business he'd already moved past. You should feel proud, he told Alara. You fought harder than expected, made this expensive. Good. I hope it cost enough you think twice before trying this elsewhere. You think you won, but you just delayed inevitable. The valley will change, railroad will come, civilization will follow, everything you're preserving will disappear. Maybe, but it'll be our choice how we adapt. She held his gaze. And we'll do it together, which is more than you can say. They left him standing there, walked into December cold, rode back to the valley that was finally, legally, theirs. Spring brought changes that felt earned. Families started improvements they'd feared investing in. Sarah expanded her barn. Marcus built proper storage. Lumber Brothers bought better equipment. Gideon and Alara added a bedroom for the children, planted fruit trees that wouldn't produce for years, the kind of investment you made believing you'd see the harvest. Caleb turned 12, started helping Marcus with advanced trap lines. Maisie's school grew to 6 children. The valley was becoming more than scattered survival, community that chose to work together because they'd learned that's how you survive things trying to break you. Summer brought news the railroad chose a route skirting the valley instead of running through. Granger's whole scheme had been for nothing. He'd consolidated land and fought battles for access to a corridor the railroad didn't want. They heard he sold holdings and moved south, chasing other opportunities. He'd failed here, but men like him rarely learned lessons beyond finding easier targets. The valley threw a celebration, not because they'd won exactly, but because they'd survived. Everyone gathered where it had all begun, bringing food and music and exhausted joy. Marcus played fiddle while people danced. Children ran wild, freed from constant tension. Sarah laughed until she cried. Gideon and Alara danced together in firelight, neither graceful but both happy in a way that felt foreign after so much struggle. "This is what we were fighting for," Alara said, head on his shoulder. "Not just land or rights. This people choosing to stay together because it's better than being apart. Thought you were fighting because you're too stubborn to let rich men push you around. That too." She smiled against his shirt. "But mostly this." Later, as celebration quieted, Alara thought about the path here. Standing in that church, feeling like life was over, like there was no future worth hoping for. The stranger who'd changed everything by choosing to see her worth when everyone else had decided she had none. How easy it would have been to give up during that first winter, the wolf attacks, when fires destroyed Sarah's barn, when Granger's lawyers made everything seem hopeless. How many times they'd been on the edge of quitting, but they'd stayed. Not because they were particularly brave or strong. They'd stayed because leaving felt like betraying something fundamental, the idea that people who worked hard deserved to keep what they built. That community mattered more than individual survival. That love was worth fighting for, even when fighting seemed impossible. Years later, people would ask about those early days, about the stranger bride who became a community's backbone, the homesteader who married her on impulse, the children who survived fire to become teachers and builders. She'd tell the truth. None of it had been smooth or perfect or well-planned. They'd made mistakes, failed at things, struggled with doubts constantly. Love and community and survival were daily choices, not destinations you reached and relaxed into. But she'd also tell them that choosing to fight for something imperfect was better than accepting something empty. That building a life with someone you loved in a place you'd claimed through sweat and stubborn refusal felt better than any easy path. That night, Gideon pulled Alara aside from the crowd. They walked to the clearing's edge where they could see their cabin in the distance. "I never thanked you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For saying yes in Black Hollow. For choosing this when you had every reason to say no. For teaching me being alone isn't the same as being safe." He took her hand. "You saved my life that day, same as I saved yours. We saved each other. That's how this works." Is that what we tell the children? Two desperate people made a wild choice and didn't regret it? We tell them the truth. Love isn't always neat or logical. Sometimes it's two strangers deciding to trust each other with nothing but hope. Sometimes it's choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. Sometimes it's fighting for something together until you can't remember fighting alone. He kissed her then, soft and certain, while the valley they'd built stretched around them. Behind them, celebration continued. People who'd learned survival through standing together, who'd discovered connection was stronger than isolation. The children found them, appearing from darkness with confidence of kids who knew they were safe, whose parents would always come back. "Are you coming back?" Maisie asked, taking Alara's hand. "In a minute, sweetheart." Marcus says he'll teach me fiddle if I promise not to torture it. You should learn. Gideon ruffled her hair. They walked back toward Celebration, surrounded by family and community, and the valley they'd refused to surrender. Alara thought about that woman standing outside a church with no future and no hope. She wished she could tell that woman what was coming, not to make it easier, but to promise it would be worth it. Every frozen morning and burned building and legal battle. Every time she thought she couldn't keep going but found a way anyway. Worth it. Because it led to this. Standing in a valley full of people who'd chosen each other, raising children who'd never know what it felt like to be unwanted, loving a man who'd taught her family was something you built through choice. The music played into the night, and the valley held them safe while stars wheeled overhead, and wilderness pressed close, but no longer felt threatening. They'd carved space in the world for themselves, these broken people who'd refused to stay broken, and filled it with something the world said was impossible. Community built on second chances, family formed from strangers, love earned through choosing to show up every day, even when showing up was the hardest thing. And in the morning, they'd wake and keep building. Because that's what they'd learned from surviving impossible things together. You didn't survive once and stop. You survived every day by choosing each other, by showing up, by remembering things worth having were always things worth fighting for. The valley would keep testing them. Life would keep being hard. But they'd face it together. These people who'd learned together was always stronger than alone. And that was enough. That was everything.